The shift started, as most of Maya Reyes' shifts started, with something broken. Tonight it was the crash cart in Bay 4. The defibrillator pads had been restocked with the wrong size, pediatric instead of adult, and the night shift aide who was supposed to check inventory had left a note that said checked in handwriting so cheerful, it felt like a personal insult. Maya found it at 6:03 p.m., 13 minutes into her shift, while doing the walkthrough that no one had asked her to do, and that she had been doing every single night for 2 years because the alternative was not doing it. She swapped the pads, updated the log, and said nothing to anyone because there was no one to say it to who would do anything about it. Hendricks Regional wasn't the worst hospital in the county. That was the best thing anyone said about it, and they said it the way you say at least it didn't rain, with the specific relief of someone who has given up on Sunny. It was a public hospital on the east side of the city, the kind that took everyone and got thanked by no one, where the waiting room chairs were bolted to the floor because someone had stolen them once, and where the vending machine in the ER lobby had been out of order for so long that a patient had taped a handwritten sign to it that said RIP with a small drawing of a lightning bolt. The sign had been there for 8 months. Facilities had left it. Maya had been a registered nurse at Hendricks for 4 years. Before that, 2 years at County General before the budget cuts. Before that, nursing school on loans, she was still paying off at a rate that felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. She was good at her job in the way that doesn't get you promoted thorough, patient, unspectacular in her competence because her competence never failed publicly. The nurses who got noticed at Hendricks were the ones who had crises and handled them dramatically. Maya prevented the crises. There was no audience for prevention. She had a system. Most people with her kind of life develop one. It wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in the order of her walkthrough, in the specific way she folded her notes at the end of a chart entry so she could find the page again in the dark, in the habit of always checking the second shelf of the supply closet before ordering more, because someone always left the restocks there instead of on the first shelf. Small things. Unremarkable things. The kind of things that, if they stopped happening, would become a crisis that someone else would have to handle dramatically. Room 7 was her first real patient of the night. Mrs. Okafor, 68, in for observation after a minor cardiac event, stable but anxious in the specific way of someone who has spent 68 years being told not to take up too much space, and is now lying in a hospital bed with monitors beeping and feeling like she is doing exactly that. Maya spent 6 minutes with her, not the protocol minimum. 6 minutes because that was what it took for Mrs. Okafor's shoulders to drop from their position near her ears, and shoulder tension in a cardiac patient was not something Maya was willing to leave unaddressed because it wasn't in the chart. "My daughter's driving down from Columbus," Mrs. Okafor said. "She's going to worry. Tell her the monitoring's precautionary," Maya said, adjusting the blood pressure cuff. "Her job is to sit with you, not to manage your condition. That's my job." Mrs. Okafor looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating an expectation. "You're not going to tell me not to worry. You're going to worry. That's normal. I'm just making sure there's nothing to actually worry about." The woman almost smiled. Not quite, but the shoulders dropped another half-inch. Maya moved on. The waiting room was where she went next, because the waiting room was always where something was about to become a problem if you didn't catch it first. She'd learned this the hard way, 3 years ago, when a man with a dissecting aortic aneurysm had sat in that room for 90 minutes, presenting as a backache, while the intake coordinator dealt with a system crash. He'd made it. Barely. The coordinator had cried in the break room for 20 minutes after. Maya had not cried. She had rewritten the triage intake checklist for walk-in back pain complaints and submitted it to the charge nurse. And the charge nurse had said, "I'll pass it along," and she never heard about it again. But the checklist was still there, tucked into the laminated folder at the intake desk, and she knew because she'd checked. The waiting room had 11 people in it at 6:47 p.m. She did what she always did, which was to look at each person for approximately 4 seconds, enough to register color, posture, breathing, effect without making it look like she was assessing them, Because the ones who needed assessing most were often the ones who would leave if they felt watched. She almost missed him. He was in the corner chair, the one nearest the broken vending machine, and he had the particular stillness of someone who is used to waiting in places where his presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. Late 50s, she guessed, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had been handsome and was now just definite, like something carved down to its essential shape. He was wearing a dark jacket that was a degree too thin for the weather, and he was holding a paper coffee cup that had clearly gone cold. What stopped her was his hands. She had been looking at hands long enough to read them the way other people read expressions. These were not the hands of the men who came in on cold November nights, not the roughened hands of outdoor work, not the tracked hands of long addiction. These were, she didn't have the word for it immediately, deliberate hands. The hands of someone who was accustomed to doing precise things carefully. She filed it. "Sir," she said, pausing near his chair without stopping fully. "Waiting for someone?" "Just waiting," he said. The voice was even, not hostile, not the flatness of someone on something, not the agitation of someone in pain, just measured, in a way that required some effort. She nodded and kept moving, because if she stopped at every person whose presentation didn't add up, she'd never finish her rounds. But she noted the time, 6:51, and she noted the chair, and when she came back past at 7:34, and he was still there, cold coffee and all, she stopped at the intake desk. The man in the corner, Bay C corner, gray jacket, did he sign in? Denise, the intake coordinator, pulled up the log. Daniel Osei listed chief complaint as she squinted at the screen. General, Maya repeated. "That's what I've got." Maya looked back toward the waiting room. General. She had seen General before. General was, "Sometimes I don't know how to say what's wrong, and sometimes I'm embarrassed to say what's wrong, and sometimes I've been carrying this for so long I don't remember what it felt like before." She had learned to sit with General in a way the intake system wasn't designed for. She got him moved back at 8:15 into one of the curtained bays, not because she had any clinical reason to prioritize him, but because the man with the genuinely broken arm in Bay 2 had been seen, and the space was open, and Daniel Osei had been sitting in a plastic chair for 90 minutes looking like a man who was holding something together by willpower. Alone. "No insurance card on file," Denise called after her. "I know," Maya said. She found him a gown and left him space to change and came back to find him sitting on the edge of the bed still in his street clothes, which told her more than the chart did. "You don't have to change," she said. "I just need to get your vitals. Can you tell me what brought you in tonight?" He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. "Honestly, if you want, I'm not sure." He said it without embarrassment, which was the interesting part. Not "I don't know, I'm not sure." There was a precision to the distinction. "I've been having some chest tightness. Probably nothing. I just hadn't eaten much today and I thought maybe, how long has it been since you ate?" "This morning. Early." She checked the clock. It was 8:22 p.m. "And you've been here since?" "Around 5. She took his blood pressure without commenting on the math of that, and the number was a little high but not alarming, and his pulse was steady, and when she asked him to breathe, she listened to lung sounds that were clear and said nothing about the fact that she'd half expected them to be, because the chest tightness of a man who hadn't eaten since early morning after a day of whatever this day had been was a well-known presentation that had a well-known intervention. "I'm going to order a basic metabolic panel and an EKG," she said, "just to rule things out, and I'm going to get you something to eat. We have crackers and peanut butter in the break room, and I'll bring you whatever's in the vending machine, the working one, down the hall. You don't have to. It's not optional," she said, in the tone she used for patients who were about to argue with their own care, medically speaking. "Low blood sugar affects cardiac presentation, and I need clean data." He almost smiled. It arrived and disappeared quickly, like something he wasn't ready to commit to, medically speaking, he said. Of course. She brought him crackers and a cup of soup from the nurse's station microwave, which technically was not for patients, and she set it on the tray table without making a ceremony of it, and she watched from the doorway as he ate with the focused attention of someone who had been hungry for longer than one day. She went back to her other patients and told herself she wasn't thinking about his hands. She thought about his hands for the rest of the shift. The EKG came back clean. The metabolic panel came back with a blood glucose of 61, which was low enough to explain the chest tightness and high enough to explain why he'd thought it was nothing. She reviewed the results at 9:45, updated the chart, and stopped in the doorway of Bay 4 to tell him. "Nothing cardiac," she said. "Your glucose was a little low. That's what you were feeling. It'll resolve with food, but I'd like you to stay another hour just to confirm." "Thank you," he said. Not the reflexive thank you of someone trying to end an interaction. The other kind. The kind that meant something specific. She was walking back to the station when Denise called across the desk. "Hey, Reyes, that patient Jose. Do you know who that is?" "Patient in Bay 4, Maya said. Denise was holding a printout, looking at it like it had said something rude to her. He's not in the system, but I ran his name and..." She lowered her voice. "He's the new department director, the one they hired from Johns Hopkins. He's starting officially next month, but apparently he's been doing some kind of quiet observation period." Maya took the printout. Read it again." Dr. Daniel Osei, MD, PhD, incoming Director of Emergency Medicine, Hendricks Regional Hospital. Previously, Chief of Emergency Medicine, Johns Hopkins Hospital. Board-certified emergency physician. Author of over 40 peer-reviewed publications in emergency systems design and triage protocol optimization. She looked at the photo. Then she looked down the hallway toward Bay 4, where the man in the too-thin jacket was finishing the soup she'd brought him from the staff microwave. She stood there for 3 seconds. Then she went back to Bay 4 and sat down on the stool near the bed, and she looked at him, and she said, So, how long have you been observing?" He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. That was the first thing she clocked, that he didn't reach for any of the easy exits. Didn't say observing what or feign confusion or pull out any of the social mechanisms that people use when they've been caught doing something they haven't fully decided whether to be embarrassed about. He just looked at her with those careful eyes and said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Maya repeated. "I know how that sounds. How does it sound?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the curtain, the ER moved through its ordinary rhythms, the PA system, the rolling of a gurney, someone asking for more saline, in a voice that suggested they'd been asking for more saline for a while. "Like I was being deceptive," he said finally. "Which I was, technically, though not with bad intent." What was the intent? He looked at his hands. Those deliberate hands which she noticed he used to organize his thinking, setting them flat on his thighs before he spoke, as if calibrating. "I've taken 3 director positions in the last 12 years, he said. "The first 2 I came in clean, introduced myself, did the proper stakeholder meetings. Everyone was on their best behavior, for months. And what I got was a performance of the hospital, not the hospital." He paused. "The 3rd time, I came in differently. I wanted to see what the place was when no one was watching." Maya considered this. It was not an unreasonable methodology. It was also not something she was ready to simply accept as justification. "And what did you see?" He looked up at her. "You," he said, "mostly." She didn't know what to do with that, so she did the thing she always did with information she wasn't ready to process, which was to file it and keep moving. "Why didn't you say anything?" "After the first week, even. Because I was still deciding." "Deciding what?" He didn't answer immediately. And the way he didn't answer told her the answer was complicated and that he wasn't going to give her a simplified version of it just because she'd asked. She found, unexpectedly, that she respected that. "I should have," he said instead. Said something, "I know that." She stood up. She needed to think, and she thought better moving. "Your glucose is going to be fine," she said. "I'd still like you to stay the hour." "Of course." She stopped at the curtain. Dr. Osei. The name felt strange in her mouth, fitted to this face she'd been reading as patient for 2 hours. The crash cart in Bay 4 had pediatric defib pads restocked tonight instead of adult. Someone initialed the inventory check as complete. She watched him process that. "That's a sentinel event waiting to happen." "Yes. I filed an incident report at 6:15. It's in the system." I just thought you should know, since you've apparently been evaluating the system. She walked out before he could respond. The hour passed. She had 8 other patients and a family in the waiting room who was convinced that their father's broken toe was a blood clot. It was not, and a genuine chest pain case in Bay 7 that kept her occupied for 40 minutes, with an attending who was good but slow, and by the time she circled back to Bay 4, the man she'd spent 2 hours reading as Daniel, general complaint, no insurance had become something more complicated. He was still there. He'd put his jacket back on. "You can go," she said, not unpleasantly. Glucose was back to 84 on the recheck. "Eat something real when you get home." "I will." He stood. He was taller than she'd registered in the chair. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "That incident report. You filed it at 6:15. "Yes." "You'd been on shift for 12 minutes. 13. Something moved in his expression. She couldn't name it exactly, not surprise, because she got the sense he didn't surprise easily. Something more like recognition, the face of someone who has been looking for something and found it where they expected it, which was somehow more moving than finding it somewhere unexpected. "Do you do that every shift?" "The walkthrough?" "Yes." "Who asked you to?" "No one." He nodded slowly, like he was adding this to something, filing it the way she filed things. "Thank you for the soup," he said, "and the crackers." "Thank the nurse's station microwave," Maya said. "I just operated it." He almost smiled again. This time it made it further. "Get some sleep, miss." "Reyes. Maya Reyes." He said her name quietly, once, to himself, in a way that felt like writing something down. Then he left, and she stood at the nursing station watching him walk through the sliding doors into the November dark, and she had the specific feeling of someone who has just had an encounter that isn't over yet, even though all the visible parts of it are. "He left," Denise said from behind her. "I can see that. He didn't tell you who he was. Eventually he did." "Only because you already knew." Denise leaned on the counter. "You're not mad?" Maya thought about that. "I'm something," she said. "I haven't decided what yet." The next 11 days proceeded in the ordinary way of Maya Reyes's life, which meant they were relentless and underpaid and punctuated by small moments of either absurdity or grace, depending on how you looked at them. The absurdity, the vending machine rip sign, was finally removed by a maintenance worker who then fixed the wrong vending machine, so now the one in the lobby worked and the one by the break room didn't. The grace. Mrs. Okafor's daughter arrived from Columbus and sat with her mother through the night, and in the morning stopped at the nursing station to say, simply, "She said you were kind to her. I want you to know that mattered." Maya thanked her, and meant it, and thought about it on the drive home. There were other things. A 12-hour shift that ended in a car that wouldn't start until the 3rd try. A phone call from her landlord about the late rent, which she handled with the patience of someone who has handled it before and knows exactly how many more times she can handle it before something gives. A message from her sister in Phoenix that she answered at 1 a.m. while eating cereal over the sink because she hadn't had time to do dishes, and the table was covered in mail she hadn't opened yet. She didn't see Dr. Osei. She told herself she wasn't looking. She was not looking. She was doing her job, which she did the same way whether anyone was watching or not, which was the whole point. Except, she noticed things she hadn't let herself notice before, now that she knew someone had been watching. The way the night charge nurse, Calloway, had developed a habit of being loudly present whenever a supervisor was in the building and nearly invisible the rest of the time. The way the supply ordering system worked on a lag that meant you were always working with last week's inventory and compensating with improvisation. The way certain patients uninsured, difficult to communicate with, outside the expected demographic waited fractionally longer at every stage, not by design, but by the accumulated weight of 100 small unconscious decisions that no one had ever named out loud. She'd known all of this. She'd known it for 4 years. What was different was that someone had been standing in her waiting room for 3 weeks knowing it too, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was a comfort or a complication. On the 12th day after his ER visit, she walked out of a supply closet and nearly into him. He was in street clothes again, Different ones, better ones. The clothes of a man who is not pretending to be something other than what he is. He had a hospital ID badge now, the temporary kind that said "Administration Visitor" in small letters under his name. He was reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she stopped short in the hallway, and they stood there for a moment in the specific awkwardness of two people who have had an unexpectedly intimate interaction and have not yet decided what the second one looks like. "Miss Reyes," he said. "Dr. Ozai. A beat." "You're here," she said, which was not her most articulate moment. "Official visit," he said. "Meeting with the chief of staff this afternoon." He paused. I came by the ER first because I thought he stopped. Started again. I owe you a real conversation. About the 3 weeks. If you're willing to have it." Maya shifted the supply box she was carrying. "I'm on shift in 8 minutes." "I know. After?" She looked at him for a moment, those careful eyes, that deliberate stillness. She thought about the soup, about the way he'd said her name like he was writing it down, about the crash cart and the incident report and 3 weeks of watching, and what exactly someone sees when they watch the thing she does every night without an audience. "The coffee place on Meridian," she said. "I get off at 7. 7, he said. "I'll be there." She walked to the ER and did not let herself examine the fact that for the first time in a long time, the end of her shift felt like it was heading somewhere other than her car and the drive home. She was 20 minutes late because a late-arriving patient needed a full intake, and Maya was the one who did it, but he was still there when she got to the coffee place on Meridian, which told her something, and he had ordered her a coffee without asking what she wanted, which would normally tell her something less flattering, except that what he'd ordered was a plain black drip coffee, and she didn't know how he knew that was what she drank. And then she remembered that he'd been watching for 3 weeks, and she sat down across from him and said nothing for a moment. "The crash cart incident report," he said without preamble. "I checked the system. It was the 14th you'd filed in the last 6 months. 15th, she said. One got lost in the transition to the new software." He looked at her steadily. "What happened to the reports?" "They went to Callaway. He passes them to administration. I've never heard back on any of them. Have you escalated?" "To who?" "Callaway is the escalation point. Above that is administration, which is where the reports go and disappear. I'm not a supervisor. I'm a floor nurse." He was quiet for a moment. "You know the system well enough to know exactly where it breaks. You learn where things break," Maya said, "when you're the one who has to work around them." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I want to tell you why I was really here. Not just the observation. There's something else." She waited. 6 months ago, he said, before I accepted this position, I was reviewing incident reports from regional hospitals as part of a systems analysis for a research project, aggregate data, de-identified. But one report kept coming back in the analysis as an outlier, a sentinel event from 3 years ago here, where a protocol failure was caught before it became a patient death. The report was meticulous, detailed in a way that most incident reports aren't. The corrective action notes were specific, structural, not "will do better," but "here is the exact mechanism by which this will not happen again." Maya felt something shift in her chest, quiet and significant, like a weight settling into its correct position. "That report," he said, "had a nurse's signature on it. I couldn't see the name de-identified, but I could see the badge number." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout, partially redacted. At the bottom, a badge number. She knew her badge number the way she knew her own phone number. "I came here," he said, "to find whoever wrote that report, because the kind of thinking in it, the way it mapped failure points, the way it proposed system change instead of individual blame, is exactly the methodology I need for the redesign I'm planning. And then I sat in your waiting room for 3 hours and watched you do your walkthrough." The paper sat between them on the table. She didn't pick it up. "You could have just asked," she said. "I know. So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she understood the answer had layers and that he was deciding how many of them to give her. "Because if I'd walked in as the incoming director and said, 'I'm looking for the nurse who wrote the best incident report I've ever read,' you would have been on your best behavior. You wanted to see who I was when no one was watching. Yes. And? He looked at her across the table with those careful eyes that had been taking notes for 3 weeks. You're exactly who I thought you'd be, he said. Which is, he paused. That's rarer than it sounds. Outside, the November dark had fully arrived, and the coffee place on Meridian was nearly empty, and Maya Reyes sat with her hands around a cup that was going cold because she hadn't been drinking it, and felt the strange sensation of being truly seen by someone who had looked carefully enough to actually find her. She picked up the paper with the badge number. She turned it over. She set it down. What's the redesign? She asked. He smiled. The full version this time. I was hoping you'd ask that, he said. The meeting with the chief of staff was on a Thursday. Maya knew this not because anyone told her, but because on Thursday the third-floor conference room, which was visible from the nursing station, if you stood at the right angle, was occupied for 4 hours by people in suits that didn't belong to anyone on staff, and because Calloway spent the morning being demonstrably available in ways he was never demonstrably available on any other day, appearing at the nursing station 3 separate times to ask if everything was all right with a sincerity so studied it had the opposite of its intended effect. She didn't hear what happened in the meeting. She heard from Denise, who heard from someone in billing, who overheard a fragment of a phone call in the elevator that the incoming director had asked for a complete audit of the last 18 months of incident reports, and that the chief of staff, Dr. Harlan Price, had agreed with the particular enthusiasm of someone who did not expect to find anything. He's going to find things, Denise said. Yes, Maya said. Are you? Denise looked at her with the careful expression of someone trying to ask a question without quite asking it. Are you involved in whatever he's doing? He asked for my input on some structural things, Maya said, which was true, and also not the complete shape of the thing. But the complete shape of the thing was still in process, and she didn't have the words for it yet. She had met with Daniel 3 times since the coffee on Meridian. The meetings were technically professional. He asked questions about process. She answered them. He took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting she couldn't fully read, which she found both frustrating and interesting. But the meetings were also something else. In the specific way that conversations become something else, when 2 people who think in similar ways finally find each other and discover the relief of not having to translate. He was meticulous. She'd expected that, from the methodology of the 3 weeks. What she hadn't expected was how much of his thinking happened out loud, how he processed by asking questions, not rhetoric questions but real ones, questions where he genuinely didn't know the answer and needed her to give it to him. It was disarming in a man of his credentials. She said this once, obliquely, and he said, I know what I don't know. What I don't know here is what it's like to be where you are. That's what I need. What she hadn't told him was that she found his presence, his specific, deliberate, careful presence, harder to think around than she would have liked. She had not, in 4 years at Hendricks, found anyone's presence difficult to think around. This was, she recognized, not a neutral development. The complication arrived on a Monday. She heard about it before she saw it. Calloway, in the break room, voice pitched at the carrying volume he used when he wanted an audience. She was in the hallway, close enough to hear clearly. Personal interest in a staff nurse, which is not appropriate, which, frankly, is the kind of thing that needs to go to HR before this man has his first official day. She went still. Doesn't matter what his credentials are. You can't come into a hospital and spend 3 weeks doing whatever he was doing and then start having private meetings with a floor nurse. Someone said something she couldn't make out. I'm saying it looks bad. It looks like he identified someone and I don't know what he's doing. But it's not appropriate, and I'm going to say so to Price. Maya stood in the hallway for a moment. Her hands were still. That was something she'd learned about herself under pressure. Her hands went completely still, like the rest of her body was trying to be very quiet so her mind could work. She could think of 2 possible interpretations of what she'd just heard. The first was that Calloway was genuinely concerned about professional ethics. The second was that a man who had watched 15 incident reports disappear into his outbox was now learning that someone was conducting an audit of incident reports, and had identified who was talking to that person and was doing the only thing left to him. She pushed open the break room door. Calloway stopped mid-sentence. There were 2 aides in the room, and the overnight pharmacy tech who was on his break, and the silence that followed her entrance had a specific texture, the texture of people who have just been caught doing something they feel differently about now that the subject of it is present. "Maya," Calloway said. His voice changed register, became something more moderate. "I heard," she said. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to, and she knew she didn't need to, and she thought for a moment about what her mother had told her once about the difference between anger that shows and anger that works. "I want to be clear about something. The meetings with Dr. Osei are about incident reports and protocol gaps I've documented over the last 4 years. They're professional. I have notes. He has notes. If you have concerns about the appropriate handling of those meetings, I'd suggest raising them with Dr. Osei directly." "That's not Calloway started. Or with HR," Maya said. "If you genuinely believe something improper has happened, HR is the right channel." She held his gaze for a moment. "Is there something specific you'd like to document?" He didn't say anything. The pharmacy tech was looking at the ceiling with the focused interest of someone deeply committed to not being involved. "Okay," Maya said. She got her coffee. She walked out. She texted Daniel from the stairwell. "Calloway is going to Price. Heads up." He responded in 4 minutes. "I know. He already did. Can you talk at 6? She had a patient at 5:30 and didn't know how long it would run. She wrote back, "Try. No promises." She made it at 6 to 10. He was in the small family consultation room on the 2nd floor neutral ground, not his yet unofficial office, which said something about how he was thinking about the meeting. He had the yellow legal pad. She sat across from him, and he set the pad aside. "Price called me this morning," Daniel said, before the Calloway conversation, actually. He'd gotten preliminary results from the audit. "And 11 of your 15 incident reports are either partially filed or missing from the administrative record. 2 were never entered into the tracking system at all. One of them," he stopped. "One of them is the Sentinel event report from 3 years ago, the one that's referenced in my research." Maya was quiet. "The original is in your personnel file," he said. "Your copy. Because you kept a copy." "I keep copies of everything," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "Price says he's in a difficult position. He didn't know. I think he genuinely didn't know. But not knowing when you're the chief of staff is its own kind of problem." "What does Calloway say?" "He says the reports were forwarded appropriately and any gaps are a software issue." "The software that's been in place for 8 months, Maya said. "But the missing reports go back 4 years. "Yes." The consultation room was small, and the November light through the window was doing what November light does, which is nothing warm. Maya looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about 4 years of walkthroughs and 14 incident reports and 15 and the crash cart and misses, Okafor's shoulders and the man with the aortic aneurysm who made it barely, and the checklist that no one had asked her to write and that was still in the laminated folder at the intake desk. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need the copies," he said. "All of them. And I need you to understand that once I file what I'm going to file, this gets complicated. For you, people are going to know you're the one who documented this. Some of them are going to be unhappy about that. I know. I want to be clear that you have a choice. I can pursue the audit without your copies. It'll take longer and the picture will be less complete, but I have a flash drive," she said. "At home. I can bring it tomorrow." He looked at her with that quality she'd first read in the waiting room chair, the stillness that was not passivity but attention. "You've been keeping this for 4 years, he said quietly, without knowing anyone was going to use it. "I kept it because it happened," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I just knew I wasn't going to pretend it didn't happen." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The research project I mentioned, the systems redesign. I've been writing the grant proposal for 3 months, and I've been stuck on one piece, the clinical methodology. I need a co-investigator who understands the floor-level failure points, who's actually lived in the system long enough to map the gaps." She looked at him. That's a separate conversation, he said quickly. From all of this, I'm not Dr. Ozai. Daniel. She tried the name. It settled differently than she expected. Are you asking me to be on your research team? I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider it. She stood up. She needed to get back to the floor. There was a patient in Bay 3 who was going to need her IV restarted, and she'd been gone longer than she intended. Bring me the proposal, she said. I'll read it. She was at the door. Maya. She turned. He had both hands flat on the table, that calibrating gesture. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not quite even. The Callaway thing. I need you to know if I'd anticipated that this would become a target on your back, I would have... You would have what? She said, not unkindly. He didn't finish the sentence, which was honest. I've been filing reports for 4 years, she said. If someone wanted to make me a target, they had a lot of time to do it. They didn't. They waited until someone was paying attention. She held the door. That tells me something about who the real problem is. She left him with that. She was halfway down the hall when her pager went off. Bay 3, IV, as predicted. She broke into a controlled jog and did not think about the way her name had sounded in his voice, and almost managed to mean it. 2 floors up, at that moment, Callaway was in Price's office. Price was 61 and had been chief of staff at Hendrix for 9 years, and had, in those 9 years, developed a particular skill for appearing to act while deferring action, the administrative equivalent of treading water while making it look like swimming. He was good at his job in the political sense, which was a different thing from being good at it in the medical sense, and he was smart enough to know the difference, and not quite brave enough to care about it. But he was looking at the audit results on his desk. 11 reports, 4 years, and a floor nurse who had kept personal copies of all of them, organized in a flash drive she hadn't told anyone about because no one had asked. She's making us look, Callaway started. She documented patient safety issues, Price said, without looking up from the desk, and filed reports that didn't reach administration. That's not a narrative about her. Price. That is a narrative, Price said, about where the reports went. The silence that followed was the kind that means the conversation has moved somewhere. The person who started it did not intend to go. And in Bay 3, 2 floors down, Maya was restarting an IV with the clean efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times, talking to the patient about his daughter in Columbus while her hands worked, and in the consultation room on the 2nd floor, Daniel Osei was sitting at the table with his yellow legal pad, looking at something no one else in the building could see yet, and the thing neither of them knew was that tomorrow morning, Callaway was going to do something they hadn't anticipated, something that was going to force a timeline that was supposed to be weeks into a single afternoon. And the flash drive that Maya kept at home in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus was going to matter more than either of them had planned for it to. She found out at 7:15 in the morning, before her shift, from Denise. Callaway had filed a formal HR complaint at 5 p.m. the previous day after the building had emptied enough that it was unlikely anyone would learn about it until morning. The complaint alleged that Dr. Osei had engaged in preferential conduct toward a staff nurse, had conducted unauthorized observation of staff under false pretenses, and had created a hostile environment for supervisory personnel through the selective use of audit mechanisms. It was, as complaints go, carefully written, specific enough to require a formal response, vague enough to avoid precise refutation. It had been copied to Price and to the hospital's legal counsel and to the union liaison for nursing staff. Maya read the summary Denise had screenshotted on her phone and stood in the parking lot in the cold morning air for a moment, with her scrubs on and her bag over her shoulder. They're going to put him on administrative hold, Denise said, until HR processes the complaint. That's usually 2 weeks? 3? 2 weeks. Maya did the math that the math didn't like. The audit results were preliminary. Without Daniel's access to the administrative systems, the follow-up on the missing reports would stall. The grant deadline he'd mentioned, twice, in passing, she'd looked it up after the second time, was in 18 days. Where is he now? I don't know. Legal had him in at 7. Maya was already walking back to her car. Cover me. I need 40 minutes. Cover you for Denise's voice. Maya, you're starting in. The car door closed. She drove home in 14 minutes. Found the flash drive in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus from 3 restaurants that had since closed. It was a small thing, matte black, nondescript, the kind that comes free with a conference registration, and it held 4 years of documentation that she had never shown to anyone because no one had ever been in a position to use it, and she had never been in a position to hand it to someone without it disappearing the same way everything else disappeared. She sat at her kitchen table for a moment, the flash drive in her hand. She thought about the night she'd written the first report, 3 years ago. A medication error that hadn't reached the patient she'd caught it, but that had traced back to a labeling issue in the pharmacy system that she'd flagged verbally twice and that had never been corrected in writing. She'd sat at her kitchen table then, too, in these same chairs, and written the report with the specific methodical anger of someone who has decided that the only useful thing to do with fury is make it precise. She'd known, writing it, that it might go nowhere. She'd written it anyway. She'd kept a copy because the thing had happened, whether or not the paperwork acknowledged it. And then she'd done it again, and again, and again, 14 more times. Not because she thought it would matter, because she couldn't not. She was in the car 4 minutes later. Legal was on the 4th floor. She didn't have access to the 4th floor. Technically, her badge opened the ER, the nursing floors, the supply chain access points, and the break room. She stood at the elevator and thought about this for approximately 3 seconds, and then she went to the 4th floor via the stairwell, which required no badge at all because the door at the top was propped open with a rubber wedge, which was a physical security gap she had actually mentioned in one of the missing incident reports, and she would have found this funny if she had more room in her chest for anything other than the thing she was trying to do right now. She found him in a small conference room, adjacent to the legal office, alone, the meeting apparently already over. He was standing at the window in his jacket, the same dark jacket from the night in the ER, and for a disorienting half-second, she saw the man from the waiting room again, still, deliberate, holding something together at a cost he wasn't advertising. He turned when she came in. Maya, how bad is it? Administratively? He set his phone on the table. 2 weeks, minimum, before they process the complaint. Price is... He paused. Price is trying to be fair, I think. He's genuinely uncomfortable. That's not the same as useful. The audit. Stalled. I can't access the administrative systems while I'm under complaint review. Can you access them if the documentation comes from somewhere else? He looked at her. He understood where this was going. Maya. I have the reports. She put the flash drive on the table between them, all 15. With the original filing timestamps, the correction notes, the follow-up actions I documented even when nothing happened. And the Sentinel event report, the complete version, not the version that made it into the de-identified database, because mine has the full protocol analysis attached. He looked at the flash drive. Something moved in his face, not relief exactly, because relief implies the outcome was uncertain, and she got the sense he'd believed in the flash drive before it was on the table. Something more like the specific feeling of watching a long thread pull taut. If you hand me that, he said, it's going to be used in a formal process. Your name is going to be on everything. My name is already on everything, she said. It's been on everything for 4 years. Calloway will say you're retaliating. Against what? I filed reports. He didn't forward them. I have timestamps proving mine came first. The union liaison. I called the union liaison from the parking lot. She's been waiting for this for 2 years, apparently. Maya sat down. The grant deadline is in 18 days. He looked at her sharply. You looked that up. You mentioned it twice. I notice things. She met his eyes. Is the grant fundable if you have this documentation? It's not just fundable, he said. It's a different paper, a better one. He was quiet for a moment. The co-investigator position, I read the proposal. I sent it to you last night. I know. I read it at 2 a.m. Something happened to his face. Not quite a smile, more like the expression before a smile, the internal move toward it. And you have the framework right, Maya said. But the floor-level failure mapping is theoretical. You've described how the gaps should appear based on systems theory. I can show you where they actually are. She looked at him. You need me on this. I know, he said. I've known since the crash cart. The November morning light came through the fourth-floor windows at an angle that was better than the light anywhere else in the building. And Maya Reyes and Daniel Osei sat across from each other with a flash drive between them and something else between them that neither of them had named yet. And she picked up the flash drive and held it out to him. He took it. His fingers brushed hers. Neither of them moved for a moment. For the record, he said, Calloway's complaint is baseless. I want to be clear about that. Everything between us has been professional, she said. Yes. A pause. Mostly. She felt the heat of that land somewhere specific. She didn't look away from it. Daniel. Yes. Get the audit done. Then we can talk about mostly. He looked at her with those careful eyes that had been reading her since a waiting room chair, and she had the feeling of being seen again, not the uncomfortable version, the other kind, the kind that feels like being found. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. The formal process took 9 days, not the predicted 2 weeks, because the union liaison, a small, precise woman named Rita, who had been waiting for something like this for longer than Maya knew, turned out to have documentation of her own. 3 staff nurses who had informally raised concerns about the incident report pipeline over the previous 2 years, and been told, without record, to route their concerns through their direct supervisor, who was Calloway. The HR committee met on day 4. The medical quality committee met on day 6. On day 7, Price called a full leadership meeting at which the audit results were presented formally, and Maya was not in the meeting. She was on the floor, where she belonged, doing her walkthrough at 6:03 a.m., and finding nothing wrong with the crash cart because Calloway, who had submitted his resignation that morning effective in 30 days, was no longer the person responsible for signing off on inventory. She heard about the meeting afterward from Denise, who had heard from Billing, who had been in the hallway when it ended. Price was Denise searched for the word. He looked like someone who's been handed the bill for a party he didn't know he was throwing. Is that bad or good? I think it's real, Denise said, which is different from either. Daniel texted her at 7:42 that evening. Grant submitted. Come to the coffee place on Meridian tomorrow if you can. I want to show you what it looks like with your name on it. She read the text in her car in the hospital parking lot. She sat with it for a moment. The engine running, the November dark outside the windows, the particular quiet of a day that had been loud in every other way. She drove home. She ate actual food, at the table with the dishes done. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept through her alarm for the first time in 4 months. The coffee place on Meridian was almost empty when she got there. He was at the same table as before, with the yellow legal pad and a coffee already waiting for her, plain black drip. She had thought, walking in, about whether she was going to say something about that, and then she looked at the stack of papers next to the legal pad and decided she would say something about it eventually, and sat down. He slid the papers across the table. The top page was the grant proposal cover sheet. Systems-level failure analysis in urban emergency medicine. A mixed methods approach. Principal investigator, Daniel Osei, MD, PhD. Co-investigator, Maya Reyes, RN, BSN. She looked at her name. She had looked at her name in a lot of places over the years. Name tags, incident reports, the loan statements that came every month with their cheerful font and their implacable numbers. Her name on a roster, on a schedule, on the parking permit that entitled her to park in Lot C, which was the farthest lot from the ER entrance. She had never seen her name on something like this. The methodology section, Daniel said. Pages 12 through 19. That's your section. I used what you gave me about the floor-level mapping, but... Daniel. He stopped. Let me just look at it for a minute, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He didn't fill the silence, which she had come to understand was one of the things about him that he knew when silence was working and he didn't interrupt it. She read pages 12 through 19. She read them slowly, the way she read things she needed to remember accurately. The methodology was she recognized her own thinking in it, the specific architecture of how she mapped failure points, but it was formalized in a way she hadn't known how to do, connected to literature she hadn't known existed. It was her thinking, and better than her thinking, made better by being in conversation with his. "It's good," she said. "It's better than good," he said. "You know that." She set the papers down. "Calloway's last day is in 3 weeks. "Yes. What happens after?" "Price is conducting a supervisory review." He's also a pause. "He asked if I would consider staying beyond the original term. He'd like me to take the permanent directorship rather than transitioning back to advisory." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I needed some time to consider it." He met her eyes, for reasons that were relevant to factors beyond the professional ones. She let that sit for a moment. The coffee place on Meridian was quiet around them, and outside the window the November morning had turned into something that was almost not uncomfortable, thin winter sun on the pavement, and the particular light that comes when the season is about to turn. "There was a patient I had 3 years ago," she said. "He came in presenting as lower back pain. He'd been in the waiting room for 90 minutes. I caught the aortic aneurysm." "I read the report," Daniel said. "I know you did. What you didn't see was what happened after." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I went to Calloway the next morning and I said, 'We almost lost someone because he waited 90 minutes presenting as back pain.' And I gave him a revised triage checklist I'd written overnight for walk-in back pain patients. And he said, 'I'll pass it along.' And I went back to the ER and I put a copy of the checklist in the laminated folder at the intake desk, without telling anyone, because I knew it might not get where it was going through the official channel, but I could put it where the people who needed it would find it." Daniel was quiet. "It's still there," she said. 3 years later, nobody removed it. "I check." He was looking at her with an expression she'd been seeing in pieces over the last few weeks, finally assembled into something she could read clearly, something that was careful and certain, and not trying to be anything other than what it was. "You've been taking care of this place," he said, "without anyone taking care of you." "Somebody finally read my reports," she said. "That's not enough." "No," she said, "but it was a start." 3 weeks after that morning, the Hendricks Regional Emergency Department held a mandatory staff meeting at 7 a.m. on a Thursday. This was unusual. Mandatory meetings were usually held at times that acknowledged the existence of shift workers. This one required the night shift to stay over and the day shift to come in early, and the result was a conference room, more densely populated than any meeting Maya could remember, and buzzing with the specific low-frequency anxiety of a group of people who have been told to assemble and haven't been told why. Daniel was at the front of the room with Price beside him, official now, the directorship announced 2 days before. He had his yellow legal pad, and he was not wearing a jacket because he was not pretending to be something other than what he was. And Maya sat in the 3rd row next to Denise and Rita from the union, and she watched him look out at the room before he spoke. "Most of you don't know me yet," he said. "Some of you have seen me in the building. A few of you," his eyes found her briefly, "have known me longer than others." He talked for 22 minutes. He talked about the audit results without euphemism, naming the number of reports, the years they covered, the outcomes that might have been different. He talked about the Sentinel event from 3 years ago and the checklist in the laminated folder at the intake desk, which, he said, would be formally incorporated into triage protocol effective immediately, with the original author credited in the documentation. He talked about the research grant the co-investigator's name and what the study would mean for the way urban emergency medicine understood its own failure points. He talked about what was going to change, in specifics, with timelines. He did not say we'll do better. He said here is the mechanism by which this will not happen again. The room was very quiet by the time he finished. Then people started talking at once, the way rooms do when they've been holding their breath, and the meeting turned into something more open-ended, and Maya was answering a question from one of the younger nurses when she looked up and found Daniel across the room, watching her. And she thought about the waiting room chair and the soup from the staff microwave and the crash cart and the flash drive in the kitchen drawer and her name, on 14 reports that went nowhere, and then on one grant proposal that went somewhere, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone is paying attention. Not performing attention, actually paying it. He made his way across the room eventually, through the noise of people who were already arguing with each other in the newly permitted way of people who have been told their arguments are wanted. How was that? He asked. Good, she said. The mechanism part. People needed to hear the mechanism. I learned that from your reports. You knew it already. I knew the theory, he said. You knew the practice. She looked at him. Take the permanent position, she said. I already did. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He almost smiled, and then he did smile, and it was the version she'd only seen a few times, the full version, no reservation in it. The grant kickoff meeting is December 15th, he said. I want you in the room. I'll be there. Not as a subject of the research. I know, she said. As a researcher. Yes. The conference room was still loud around them, people in conversation, the particular sound of a group of people who have been given permission to say things they've been thinking for a long time. Maya looked around the room, Denise, arguing cheerfully with the pharmacy supervisor about the restocking protocol. Rita, writing something in a notebook with focused energy. The younger nurses, 3 of them in a cluster near the coffee table, talking with their hands. She thought about 4 years of walkthroughs, 15 reports, the checklist in the laminated folder, the flash drive under the takeout menus. She thought about a cold paper coffee cup in a waiting room chair, a granola bar from a scrub pocket. The words not really in a voice that was precise in its honesty, that said I haven't eaten when it meant something more than that, something about what it costs to pretend you don't need things. She thought about her name on something that was going somewhere. The checklist, she said, the triage one, for back pain walk-ins. Being integrated into the protocol. Your name in the documentation, as I said. I know, she paused. I just want to hear it out loud. He said it clearly. Your name, in the documentation, as the originating author, on the record, permanently. She nodded once, absorbed it. Then she said, Coffee on Meridian. After the kickoff meeting, we have things to talk about. He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood. Things, he said. The other things, she said. The not professional ones. The mostly, he said. Yes. He looked at her steadily for a moment, those deliberate eyes, and then he said, December 15th. And the way he said it made it sound like 2 things at once, a date on a calendar and the start of something else, and she went back to the nursing floor and did her walkthrough, finding nothing wrong with the crash cart, and felt the strange and specific lightness of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and can finally, without ceremony, set it down. The things that changed at Hendricks Regional did not change overnight, because nothing real changes overnight, but they changed. The incident report pipeline was redesigned, with a direct-to-quality committee track that bypassed supervisory sign-off for patient safety concerns. The first person to use the new track was an overnight aide who had been worried for months about a recurring mislabeling pattern in the blood draw kits. Her report was in the system by morning and addressed by noon, and she told Denise, who told Maya, that she hadn't expected anything to happen so fast. I sent 3 things to Callaway last year, the aide said. Nothing. I know, Maya said. Put it in the new system. Keep a copy. Should I always keep a copy? Yes, Maya said. Always keep a copy. The checklist for back pain walk-ins, now formally incorporated into the triage protocol, had a small footnote in the administrative documentation that read, Originally developed and implemented informally by Maya Reyes, RN, November 2021. It was a small footnote. She found it by reading the protocol update carefully, which was the only way she found most things. She read it 3 times, and then she closed the document and went back to work. The research grant was funded in the spring. The kickoff meeting happened. The December 15th coffee on Meridian happened. And the conversation they had was not documented anywhere, but it was precise and honest and took 2 hours, and at the end of it, Maya drove home in the dark, with the windows cracked, despite the cold because she needed the air. She told her sister about it at 1 a.m. from the kitchen table. Her sister, who lived in Phoenix and worried about her in the particular way of someone who has been worrying for a long time and has gotten good at it, listened to the whole thing and then said, "So he watched you for 3 weeks before he introduced himself, and you're okay with that?" "He's not the first person to watch me for years without acknowledging what I was doing," Maya said. "He's the first one to do something about it." A pause. Is that enough? Maya thought about the crash cart at 6:15 in the morning, about the soup from the staff microwave, which was not for patients, about her name in the methodology section, pages 12 through 19, about 14 reports in a flash drive under takeout menus from closed restaurants, and what it means to document something true for 4 years without knowing if it will ever matter. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's just the beginning." By spring, she was running the first phase of the study. By summer, she had her own office small, on the 3rd floor, with a window that got decent afternoon light, and a research coordinator who was 24 and wanted to learn and asked questions with the specific focus of someone who takes things seriously. By the following November, she had published her first paper, co-authored, her name first. She printed a copy. She drove to Hendricks. She went to the ER, her ER, and did the walkthrough out of habit and found nothing wrong with the crash cart, and then sat for a moment in the waiting room, not the chair, by the broken vending machine, which had finally been repaired, but the one by the window, where the light came in on cold November mornings. She sat there for 3 minutes. She thought about a man in a too-thin jacket, cold coffee in his hands, and the granola bar she'd put in his hands without knowing who he was, without needing to know who he was, because the knowing wasn't the point. The point was the thing itself, the bread, the water, the record of what happened, kept carefully, in case someone was ever in a position to use it. She got up and went back to work. I keep thinking about Maya standing at that intake desk, looking at a printout with someone's credentials on it, and realizing she'd just given her last granola bar to the man who'd been reading her work for 3 weeks, and that her first move was not relief, not pride. She looked down the hallway. Then she went back and asked him directly how long he'd been watching. That's the part I can't shake. Not the recognition. The directness after the recognition. Here's what I want to ask you. If you were Maya, if you'd spent 4 years filing things into the void, would you have handed over the flash drive? Or would you have held it until you were more certain the system was actually going to work differently this time? If this one landed with you, I'd really like to hear your answer down in the comments. I mean that.